Welcome back to the Business of Biotech. I'm Matt Pillar, and I'm once again joined by friend of the show, frequent guest, and biopharma CFO extraordinaire, Allan Shaw. Allan, it's great to see you as always.
Great to be back, Matt, and great to see you.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about drug development from bench to patient. Sounds like a big conversation, but we're going to winnow it down to some of Allan's oft-seen blind spots and advice. And Allan, you've worked with so many biopharmas over the years. You bring a super diverse perspective to the conversation. And one of the things that, I've heard you wax on are the perils of insular thinking in biopharma. So I want to kick things off with, as I often do, a convoluted and multi-part question as it relates to the topic at hand. What is insular thinking in biopharma? That's one part. How does it impact timelines or the bench to patient continuum? That's two parts. And then the third part would be, how does academia help or hinder the insular thinking in biopharma situation? So how's that for a setup? You got all three of those parts?
I think I've got it. I've got a few more fingers if you dare me, but I'll. So let's come back to the timelines. I think that's easier to take that one last. What is insular thinking? I'd say it kind of, in a nutshell, it's what people only know what they know, and they don't know what they don't know. And I think sometimes we limit ourselves by not allowing ourselves to get views from other people. And, you can't, I'd say it's generally innocent in terms of that, but people just think they know the answers. They think they know what the right path is. And I'd say to your latter point, it sometimes seems to be overly informed by academia, certainly earlier stage companies where they think they have something interesting from a scientific perspective, but they're really only looking at it through one lens. And usually the logical places, a lot of times these inventions come out of academia, or when you're working with academics on these things, there's a lot of what I'd call groupthink, and they haven't necessarily have operated in the world of drug development. They've operated in the world of science, of what's interesting, and maybe how you make a name for yourself. So there's different motivations in that light. And it's certainly, from what I've observed, it's missing some of the broader considerations in terms of the landscape, the stakeholders that are involved, and whether or not what they're actually doing is going to make a difference. So, things that at least I've observed in that regard is that there's a lack of really acknowledging the competitive landscape. What is going on today? Where does what your endeavor, how does it fit in? Are there folks ahead of you? Are there people doing the same thing? Or even how do you plan to administer it? If you think you're administering it 3 times a week when other folks are doing it once a week or once every 2 weeks, that dog isn't going to hunt either.
Sure.
So there's things like that. So I guess that's where I was thinking, or how I would describe insular in that case. And I find sometimes the over-reliance on academia kind of reinforces a little bit of that.
Yeah.
Because there's experts in these areas. So if you're getting the input from these experts, maybe that's all I need to know to do what I need to do.
What are the symptoms of that, Allan? So, if there's this over-reliance on academia, this insular thinking, what are the symptoms of it? Is it, stuck? Is it too much time passing between, the idea and trying to become industrial about the idea?
Symptoms. I think some of it is more of naivete or lack of building out a group of folks that can kind of give you a 360 perspective. Because when you think about this, you want to do something that is clinically relevant, commercially relevant, where there's a real need. And I also think that there's a quick kill approach that one needs to think about too, as you go about these things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it can inform. I think it can impact timing. I think it can also impact resource allocation. Maybe certain projects shouldn't even be started, or there should be certain considerations to understand before you move forward on programs. I've walked into, just to give you an example, I've been in situations where people have been focused on developing IO products, thinking IO, it's one of the modalities of the day. But they were so, going back to, I guess, using the word insular, they were not aware that they were, 1,000, 2,000 different combination going on outside of their four walls. And further to that, I remember them telling me, well, this is our competitive advantage. We developed this incredible assay. And I said, that's very interesting. I guess, okay, we'll give the folks that are in the clinic already with those 2,000 compounds a head start. But, maybe for preclinical assets, maybe there's a competitive advantage here. I'll hear you out on that.
Yeah, give them a head start, keep it competitive. It raises an important question, though, and I'm curious about this. Maybe the answer is obvious, but it's not obvious to me. When you take these competitive considerations into account, things like you said, who else is doing this, and then even deeper than that, who else is doing it better? With fewer administrations, whatever it might be. Where do you go to suss all that out? Like what's the approach or the protocol for studying that landscape and going in with eyes wide open?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, and I don't think there's necessarily I mean, there are, I guess, as long as you've got a bank account and you're willing to pay for information, there's certainly consultants that one goes to, and certainly with the companies that I work with, I certainly encourage them to do that. And there's different levels of desktop analysis that you can do at various cost points. You don't have to go to LEK or BCG or one of these large shops, which will cost you a fortune. There's a lot of great boutique shops out there. And I'm sure my colleagues in those categories would be happy if I referred you guys to it. So anyone who wants to follow up, but I find them to be very cost effective. It helps you answer some questions, and I think it helps on a number of different levels. Right? It reinforces that where you're going, there's a therapeutic need. It gets a sense of where you need to design your studies and how you might design them to try to differentiate your products. I mean, with 13 different checkpoints that are in the market right now, each one of them have gone to market with a different lead indication, right? So there's a different way to develop an approach, even if you're Me Too, and I would encourage a Me Too development approach.
Yeah.
Or asset allocation. So that, to me, that's the most cost-effective way to get those important answers answered. I think there's other ways. I mean, there's canned publications you can get. I don't put a lot of value in them, but they're certainly helpful. I certainly look at from a Wall Street perspective, a lot of the banks reports, they periodically put out really good pieces about the industry. Today, for instance, Cowen put out a great report on IO. Mm-hmm. I thought they're missing a few things, but overall, I thought it was a very good report and very informative. It certainly provides a baseline. So that to me, if I was looking for a landscape, IQVIA puts out research periodically, Vantage. So, there's a number of other places. Bio organization puts out, where money's being invested in different therapeutic areas. So, so there's different places. And I find even Twitter right now is an incredible reservoir of information. But so there are different ways to approach it, but I think it's really, really important to, whether you're early in drug development or later on, to really understand your competitive landscape. And not only does it inform you on how you prioritize and what you develop, I think it's also important in terms of how you go about developing the assets, as I've talked about. And when raising money, I think if you go into a room to raise money and you can't speak to your competitive landscape, I don't think people are going to want to give you money to invest in your company, you know.
Right.
So I think it speaks to one's stewardship as well.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned scientific studies a minute ago, and I wanted to ask you about that. And that's obviously super important to those preclinical among our listeners. What questions should leaders of those organizations be asking to ensure that their scientific studies are being designed to answer the right and the right important questions?
To me, that really hits the nail on the head. I'm really glad you asked that. I think a lot of times people, you know, as I've said before, time is the enemy, and you want to be able to get important questions answered, and they vary, right? I'm not the scientist, but I know enough that you want to bring the right advisors, the right folks, subject matter specialists, to kind of pressure test, you know, what are you looking to do, and answer for that. You know, people that I admire, that I work with, you know, one of the things they do is they go around to the different folks that they plan to partner with the product in advance of developing it. You know, this is our hypothesis. This is what we think about it. What do you need to see for you to be serious about it? And, you know, there's so, you know, with that benefit, you know, you're identifying the questions that need to be answered earlier on, rather than spend 3 years in development to try to get to those answers. Let's get them now. Yeah. There's also, you know, different modalities and different types of molecules have had different levels of success. You know, Sting, for instance, is one that's had mixed success in the IO community, for instance. And, you know, I think there's different approaches to that. And, you know, if you're going to try to be the fifth person that's going to do something that hasn't necessarily worked out for somebody, just making that up, you know, you should have an approach that's going to be fundamentally different. Why are you going to be successful while others have failed before? So, you know, answering those questions earlier than later, I think are really, really important as well. And sometimes people don't want to answer those questions. I think we've talked about, but sometimes people are looking at this as more of a job, and they, you know, they want to just keep the lights on and keep working. But that doesn't necessarily advance the ball or create value at the end of the day. I don't think that's necessarily a sustainable strategy.
Sure, it could have the opposite effect, right? Not keeping the lights on, right? It's going to turn the lights off ultimately, right?
Eventually.
Right. You've you know, the time is the enemy mantra is one that you've shared with me on many occasions. How do you? So another two-part question: how do you sort of quantify the value of a quick kill, and how do you? So that's part one, and then part two would be, how do you know when it's time to pull the plug?
You know, the pulling the plug is probably one of the hardest. It can be a hard question. In terms of the importance of the quick kill, then we can come back to how do you pull the plug? Yeah. To me, it's part of it is there's an opportunity cost with everything that we do. And if you continue to, you know, I guess it goes down to, you know, if you make a wrong turn and you continue going down that road, it's still a wrong turn. You know, so you want to be able to get back on the road as soon as possible. And if you keep going down that road, it's just going to take you longer to get back there, and you're just wasting time, and there's the opportunity cost. The other factor is too, that while you're doing this, you're burning overhead, right? You know, and to me, overhead, people think, well, we're not spending it as quickly and our runway gets extended, but actually it's in converse. You're compressing your timeline, because the longer you're not executing and creating value, you're allocating actually more money to overhead that would otherwise be going into value creation. And that's a detail that gets lost on folks many times. And in terms of how do you pull the plug, you know, there's a number of different ways to answer that question. You certainly, if you run the right experiments, it becomes pretty much of a binary decision, unless there's some qualitative information out there that makes you think that there's a lesson learned. And that's good too. If you can run experiments that can better inform the next experiment, then you're answering questions. Mm-hmm. So that's good, but you got to recognize when you've hit a dead end. If you're trying to put a square peg in a round hole, and that's not, you're not helping anybody. And that's, I think, it answers your question in terms of pulling the plug. But these things can be emotional too, right? There's some people may view these things as kids, right? Yeah. And they don't want to let them go. And that becomes harder. Or if people are trying to apply a hypothesis, but they can't really put the facts behind it. I've seen that continue. So you're not helping yourself at the end of the day. But that's harder, particularly when there's emotions involved.
Sure.
And I think the easiest way to get there is what are our choices, and coming back to opportunity cost.
The Business of Biotech is brought to you in partnership with Cytiva. Together, we're committed to helping the leaders of new and emerging biopharma companies navigate the financial, organizational, human resources, and regulatory waters you'll encounter on your way from discovery to the clinic and beyond. Check out a host of useful resources for biotech leaders at Cytiva's Emerging Biotech Accelerator at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA lifesciences.com/emerging biotech.
You just mentioned overhead. What fat should be avoid? Fat, I use the term fat, right? For unnecessary, if you will, overhead should be avoided.
Well, I guess maybe it's worth just briefly defining overhead, which is, I guess I would fall into overhead. Anything that's what I would say is not related to drug development, right? I would say more of your general administrative business function, maybe office space isn't as much these days, but things like that. I think running experiments on de-risking and advancing the technology is where much of the money should be going for earlier stage organizations, because they can't afford it. And I think you want to stay lean, you want to stay nimble, and invest where there is money, where there's value to be created. Going back to evidence of fat, we can go there, but so the only point is the longer you're developing your drug, the more you're burning the candle on the other end. Is the point on overhead. In terms of overhead creep, I would say that kind of correlates. I've noticed there's a correlation to the more money a company has, the more overhead fat creeps into it. I find that if you want to get something done, you give it to a busy person. And I think if you want to be inefficient with your capital deployment, you look to companies that have more capital than they've had before. I think, I try to remind people, and I think I've said this before, that you got to always retain a level of financial discipline, whether it's $1 billion in the bank or $100,000 in the bank.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about clinical relevance. Determining whether a product is clinically relevant, like it seems obvious, but it's easier said than done. What are the hallmarks of clinical relevance, and conversely, what are the signs of irrelevance?
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting consideration. I think a lot of what the industry has done over the years has been incrementally beneficial. You see a lot of Me Too products that just kind of life cycle management and how they're moving along, and because of their large size, in many cases, has kind of inhibited innovation in those areas, and they've been maintained. I think it's been a lot in more of the general care indications.
Mm-hmm.
And I think now payers and others are pushing back on that. So, if you're looking to really create significant value, if you're really looking to make an impact on the patient community, marginal improvements, I don't think there's a big appetite on that these days. And I think it's going to be harder to monetize those and make a market for those as well, assuming that you can finance those situations. I think people are looking for things that improve outcomes in a meaningful manner. I've been using oncology a lot as examples, but again, just the contrast that, you're looking at in the past, you'd looked at incremental improvements that improved survival or progressive-free survival by months, weeks. Now you're looking at indications that are kind of turning oncology into more of a chronic disease. Mm-hmm. To me, that's victory at the end of the day. That's short of a cure, but it's far better than the death sentence it used to represent.
Right.
So to me, things that are going to move the needle as opposed to marginally beneficial, I think are certainly one of the things to look at. I think you also need to look at the marketplace too, and I think even looking at, gene therapy a little bit, right? People are looking at the impact of some of the gene therapy on a hemophilia level versus the current products that are out there right now, in terms of whether or not is the cost benefit there?
Yeah.
To be there, right? It's not a no-brainer right now. It's the nicest thing you can say about it. It's gray, in terms of clarifying that. So you want things that I think are going to make a real big difference, because I think when you look at our healthcare system in terms of the costs that we're having out there, there's going to be a reallocation. There's clearly an appetite to make sure that there's money to pay for innovative products that can really address unmet medical needs. But I think everything else that's to the other side of that, they're not going to necessarily get the full value that they've previously gotten for their products. I think there's going to be a rebalancing there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hopefully that answers your question.
For sure. Yeah. When you mentioned the market, looking at the market, so that raises the questions around commercial assessment and feasibility. What are your thoughts on addressing how you would assess the market opportunity and market size? Is it much the same? Sort of that due diligence research you referenced earlier when we were talking about, the clinical, commercial viability.
Yeah, it's definitely an extension of that. If the competitive landscape is looking at really the patient journey, right? And now people are telling me now you have to look at the payer's journey or the payment journey, to really understand where the two pieces kind of come together, because that's the value proposition, right? You really have to understand what is the value proposition. And it's multiple stakeholders. Goes back to what we're saying earlier about insular. You can't do any of this drug development in a vacuum. You need the right advisors, and you need to understand the different stakeholders to be able to solve for this.
Yeah.
And in terms of understanding the market size, and is part of the patient journey, because you need to understand the prevalence and incidence of this, and also understand, where your drug product is necessarily going to fit in all of that. So that's really really important to understand. And you can use similar people, but also I think one of the questions also is, particularly as you're designing studies, and most people think they can push on this, but as early as phase 2, getting some input in terms of what the payers are looking for is really important. And as we're looking at the value proposition, it's less and less. Certainly clinical data and patient data is really important, but you also need to start thinking about collecting the economic data, in terms of rehospitalizations and how does this take costs out of the system? And I think that's really an important one.
Yeah.
And I think talking to investors and talking to people and talking to stakeholders, you want to be able to have an understanding of the market and the folks involved, because that's also important in terms of patient recruitment, medical affairs, and building up the folks that help you commercialize this and help you accrue for your clinical studies.
Okay, so you mentioned the payer, the payer layer, if you will, which brings to mind another multi-part question. What are some good practices, I guess, around building a plan, to position or monetize the product from a payer standpoint, and when do you start thinking about that? When do you start kind of building that plan out?
I would say that sooner than most people think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I think people are waking up to the need that should be sooner than later. I think historically people waited till they were running their phase 3 studies before they started doing that. Mm-hmm. I think it becomes increasingly important to do it sooner. I think, doing it in advance of your phase 2 can be very helpful in terms of informing some of your trial designs. I think from a partnering perspective, these things are also incredibly important, because if you can't speak to the value of your product, how do you expect to maximize the value for your product when you're trying to partner with somebody? Yeah. It's really beholden on the company to be able to articulate the value. Your suitor isn't going to negotiate against themselves. So I think that's another factor. And that's also important to answering all of those scientific questions up front, too. If you don't understand your mechanism of action, that's important until you have a lot of patient data. Once you have a lot of patient data, that becomes less relevant. But going back to earlier stuff. So it's kind of getting your ducks in a row.
Yeah. It's thinking in terms of a small, a new small biotech. Whose job is it ultimately? Obviously resources are limited. A lot of these preclinical, a lot of the stuff is like preclinical thinking, and a lot of roles are remaining to be filled in preclinical companies. So, the easy assumption is it starts at the top, and this tracking with these thoughts needs to happen from the top down. But from your perspective, who else in the organization is or should be sort of leading the charge?
I would say the leadership team. It's still kind of an extension of what you said in terms of starting at the top. Mm-hmm. Certainly the CEO, everything begins and ends with the CEO. But I would say the leadership team, a lot of these are strategic in terms, there are a lot of tactical stuff, but I think you got to start in terms of what you're trying to solve for. I think engagement of the medical affairs folks very early on, and that gives you a whole insight in terms of the patient journey. Yeah. I think you do want to understand, even before you start developing or spending money, understanding the competitive landscape is important, so that if you're going to start a farm, you want to be in fertile soil with the right irrigation. So this would be no different. You just want to make sure that you're focused on the right game.
Yeah.
If you're hunting for deer and it's bear season, you're not going to do well.
And my wife, it's great sport for my wife to make fun of my analogies. Apparently my analogies are always off. I wish I had your knack for analogy. What about, I want to get your, I think maybe one or two more questions. We're going to have to wrap things up here, Allan, but I want to get your take on, in that early stage, what are we going to do with this molecule? What are we going to go after? What are your thoughts around marginal, kind of incrementally better drug products versus those that are potentially, paradigm shifting, like big innovators? And I guess the question that I have around that is, what's the, is there a safe bet? Is there, is one a big, the potential for the big payoff worth it? How do you determine which to pursue?
It's a provocative question. I would think no less. I expect them from you. I think swinging for the fences. Biotech, I think, is all about swinging for the fences. It's about the promise. It's about translating innovative medicine into impactful technology that can really improve patients. Certainly from a philosophy perspective, starting up, I certainly like to make an impact, and that's that gets me jazzed. I would also say that just being a pragmatist in this marketplace, there's there's never been more money out there than there is now. There's never been more people out there trying to get that money. Yeah. And I think if you want to differentiate people and get people's attention, I think if you're kind of in yesterday's paradigm of marginal innovation, I think you're going to be trying to raise money for a really long time. And then you got to ask yourself, to what end? Because even if you get to the promised land of getting your labor of love approved, is there really going to be a market for it? I think people used to think that just getting your drug approved, there was an exit, you go home and your life is happy forever after. I think there's a reality here that getting your drug approved is not necessarily, there's a lot of work after that. It's like Some people thinking an IPO is a finish line, and that's just the continuum of your capital formation. I think if you want to be successful, I would increase your probability of success by focusing on things that will move the needle, and not just the financial needle, but for stakeholders, for patients, and in order to make the world a better place. I think pharma's done an incredible job over the last 12 months in terms of changing their image. And I think, you can ask yourself why it's taken people so many years to recognize the impact on pharma. When I think about the impact, it's more profound than anything that any country has done or any human aid effort has been done in recent memories. I think we should channel that positive energy and good karma. And we're just in the first inning. There's so much more to come.
Yeah. That's a fitting place to end, Allan. It's been an informative conversation as always. I appreciate your transparency and insight. It's always a pleasure. I look forward to the next time we have you on the show.
Absolutely. Always a lot of fun, and already looking forward to next time.
Yeah, we'll make a date soon. So that's Allan Shaw. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online in partnership with our friends at Cytiva, a life sciences company dedicated to the support of new and emerging biotechs. You can learn more about Cytiva by visiting cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. I'd also like to encourage you to visit bioprocessonline.com to subscribe to my newsletter. And if you like what you heard here, subscribe to the pod, give us 5 stars, and tune in next week. Until then, thanks for listening.